Not too long ago, budget smartphones used to be really starved of features, but that's no longer the case. Today we're looking at the Poco M7 Pro 5G, which on paper seems pretty tempting. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it's available in two configurations. You've got an 8GB RAM variant with 256GB of internal storage that can be found for roughly £160 to £200, while a 12GB RAM variant with 256GB of internal storage can be found for roughly £200 to £240. In this review, you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and how it compares to some of its key competitors. So to kick things off, I would just like to point out that within the box you've got the smartphone with a pre-applied screen protector, a USB Type-C to Type-A cable, and a rubbery protective case, which is certainly appreciated as it prevents your phone from rocking about when placed flat on a surface. Quite a shame, however, because the overall aesthetics are actually very stylish. It's available in a purple, silver, or the pictured green, which I actually do quite like. It has got a rock texture to it, although make no mistake, the surface itself is completely flat and also quite slippery. Now, around the phone, you have got a volume rocker with a power button on the right-hand side, a 3.5mm jack at the top, and also a USB Type-C port that's found at the bottom. Here you'll also find a SIM tray, which will take 2 nano SIMs, although it can also take a micro SD card, therefore allowing you to expand on the 256GB of internal storage that the manufacturer provides. Elsewhere, you've also got stereo speakers, which actually do perform pretty well across the sound frequency range, and they also get pretty loud as well, making it handy for multimedia usage, or of course if you're just going to be gaming on it. Now, aside from this, the phone weighs in at just 190 grams, making it actually pretty pocketable, and you've got an IP64 rating, therefore giving you some dust and water resistance. So aside from all this, you have also got an under-display optical fingerprint sensor, which is actually pretty rapid. You can actually speed up the process even further if you so wish with Face Unlock. Although do bear in mind over here that it does not have 3D biometric data, so it's not going to be as secure. So just some food for thought. Now, you have also got a 6.67-inch 120Hz AMOLED display. Yes, indeed, over here, in comparison to some cheaper alternatives out there on the market, it's opting for an OLED display in comparison to an LCD IPS. And that certainly does come in handy when it comes to multimedia consumption, because everything looks a little bit better in terms of the overall contrast and also the colors. Indeed, it does really pop and has got pretty good viewing angles. As for its overall resolution, it sits at 1080 x 2400. Protecting it is Corning's Gorilla Glass 5, which will give you some scratch resistance, although it's not going to be as impressive as some more expensive alternatives out there on the market. Now, when it came from doing my own test of its display, I did find that while gaming, the touch sensitivity was not exactly the best. However, this could have also been due to the overall chipset performance, which is a little bit lackluster. And yes, I'll be touching upon that further down in this review. However, what is nice to see is that the display itself does actually get pretty bright. In the max and sunlight modes, it goes up to 465 nits. However, in the auto mode, gets up to a blinding 840 nits. In other words, it's going to be perfectly bright in a very sunlit condition. It does also get all the way down to 2.2 nits, therefore showing good sort of versatility and getting quite dim, making it handy if you're going to be using it in a completely pitch black environment. It also has got 960Hz PWM dimming, which therefore is going to reduce the overall eye strain while you're going to be using this phone. Another thing that you might want to utilize is the rear camera configuration, and here you've got a main 50 megapixel f1.5 wide lens with OIS and EIS. And then you've also got a 2 megapixel f2.4 depth lens. Yes, indeed, you have not got an ultra-wide lens, but it doesn't really bother me in the slightest because most phones at this price point actually have got pretty poor performance when it comes to their ultra-wide lenses. Although certain individuals might have appreciated its inclusion, but in my case, I actually prefer the fact that the manufacturer has focused on the main lens instead. Here you have got 2x optical zoom with up to 20x digital zoom if you so wish. I would actually side to not using the digital zoom all that much because, as you'll be able to notice from these images, it does actually get pretty grainy and blurry. Nonetheless, it can be handy in certain scenarios. But sticking to the normal 1 to 2 times zoom, I actually found myself pretty impressed by what the phone was able to achieve. Not only in terms of the overall color reproduction and the HDR, which kicked in pretty well, but also in terms of the overall skin tones. everything does actually perform pretty well, specifically for a phone of its price point. And it certainly does provide slightly better images in comparison to some cheaper alternatives. Make no mistake, however, it's not going to compete with some mid to flagship tier phones out there, and in this respect, these other phones will give you even better sharpness and detail. Speaking of which, over here, you might want to utilize the 50 megapixel mode on its own because it gives you even better detail, as you'll be hopefully able to see from the shots and comparisons from the regular mode that you can select via the camera app and the 50 megapixel mode. Now, while that's all very well and good, it is worth pointing out that the overall low light performance of this smartphone isn't exactly its forte. Yes, indeed, you'll be able to see some noise, specifically if you're going to be zooming in. And as for the overall HDR, it doesn't really do a good job of differentiating between a high and low light source. Nonetheless, of course, you can enable flash in order to better the overall image experience, and it is also worth considering over here that in low light photography, it can take a little bit of extra time while taking a photo. Namely, if you're going to be using the night mode, which is its own separate mode that you can select via the camera app. Now, similarly, in terms of the low light performance when it comes to its selfie camera, it's not exactly the best. Here you've got a 20 megapixel f2.5 wide lens. And yes, indeed, without the flash photography option enabled, it does look a little bit blurry. However, with the flash mode enabled, which effectively lights up your screen in white before taking a photo, and yes, this can take a few extra seconds before actually snapping the photo itself, it does do a better job. Now, I do actually like the overall portrait mode, which in this overall class of phone does do a pretty good job in comparison to some of its competitors, namely in normal lighting conditions. Furthermore, you can also adjust your aperture, be it before you're taking the photo or after, therefore giving you good sort of customization. As for normal lighting conditions when it comes to its selfie camera, I was actually left pretty impressed. Indeed, that 20 megapixel lens does do a good job of capturing a good amount of light and also detail without giving me an overly saturated image. Now, one of the major drawbacks of this smartphone is when it comes to recording capabilities. And indeed over here, it's because it's limited to 1080p at 30 FPS, both for the front and rear camera lens. It would be great to see a 60 FPS option or indeed a 4K option available for certain individuals. Nonetheless, over here, when it comes to the overall camera shake at the rear, it does a decent job. This is thanks to OIS, Optical Image Stabilization, and EIS, Electronic Image Stabilization, working in tandem. Although sometimes the latter does kick in a little bit extra and therefore means that you can see some blurriness, specifically if you're going to be running around with a smartphone. As for the front camera lens, it actually does do a pretty decent job, which will be useful for taking your video calls, for example, on certain social media apps, or of course if you're just going to be recording yourself in a certain scenario. Now, with that out of the way, what about when it comes to the all-important battery life? Because at the end of the day, this has been marketed as a multimedia smartphone at an affordable price tag. Well, here you've got a 5110 milliamp battery. And for my own controlled benchmarks, I netted a very respectable score of 19 hours and 55 minutes. Sure enough, it's not exactly the best, nor is it the worst in its class, and there are some other smartphones that will provide you even better battery life due to housing even larger battery packs. Nonetheless, I do think this will suffice for roughly 1 to 1.5 days of light to medium usage, and if you're a heavy user, then expect sub 1 day. Now, you have also got 45 watts of wired charging capabilities, which is certainly appreciated, therefore allowing you to go from 0 to 62% in a mere half an hour. Very useful if you have an appropriate charger, which by the way is included within the box with a USB Type-C to Type-A cable. I would, however, like to highlight that there is no wireless or reverse charging capabilities, but given its overall price point, that's nothing to be really worried about. Next up, we get onto raw performance, and here you've got a 6nm MediaTek Dimensity 7025 Ultra chipset with an octa-core CPU and an IMG BXM-8-256 GPU. Indeed, that's quite a bit of a mouthful. Then you've got 8 to 12 gigabytes of LPDDR4X RAM with up to 12 gigabytes of expansion available via a memory function, and also 256 gigabytes of internal storage with UFS 2.2. Now, when it came to looking at benchmarks, in Geekbench 6, I noted a single core score of 953 and a multi-core score of 2310. Yes, indeed, it's not exactly the fastest phone out there. Similarly, when it came to GFX Bench, it went all the way down to 2.8 FPS and went up to a disappointing 62 FPS. In other words, when it came to real-world usage, in other words, medium to heavy gaming, I found that the phone really struggled. When it came to light gaming, it did stutter every so often, but it was perfectly acceptable. In other words, over here, when it comes to using the phone on a more multimedia usage, I don't think you will have a problem. However, when it comes to gaming, then you might find some limitations over here. But the same could be said about a lot of the smartphones at this sort of price point, so you might want to invest more if that's something that you're looking for. Now, as for the overall software experience, it's good to see that you've got plenty of customization. This is thanks to the fact that you have got Xiaomi's HyperOS, which is built upon Android 14. It would have been great to see Android 15 out the box, because here you're promised up to 4 major updates. Now, nonetheless, when it comes to the overall software experience, I do think a lot of individuals, like myself, will be quite taken back by the amount of bloatware that's installed. Yes, indeed, you can disable or indeed uninstall a lot of the apps, but the first user experience that you're going to get is going to be, why have I got all these different apps that I never wanted? This is something that is very much present on a lot of Chinese phones, including the ones that are from Poco, but it's just something I thought I should highlight in this review. Now, on a more positive note, you have got dual-band Wi-Fi, which goes up to the AC standard, Bluetooth 5.3, which will support a bunch of different codecs, and also NFC in certain markets. For example, for those of us who live in the UK, this Poco can be used for contactless payments. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Poco M7 Pro 5G, which is of course not quite perfect. Here, the bloatware is certainly not appreciated. The software could have been a little bit more optimized specifically with its chipset, and the fact that low light photography and recording capabilities are quite lackluster. However, aside from some of these features, I do think it does actually tick quite a lot of boxes. So here you've got some really nice aesthetics, no matter what sort of color finish you go for, a pretty competent front and rear camera configuration, at least in normal lighting conditions, a USB Type-C port that takes up to 45 watts of wire charging, a 3.5mm jack with stereo speakers with Dolby Atmos support, a pretty fluid 120Hz AMOLED display, which will stand tall against some IPS LCD alternatives, a built-in under-display fingerprint sensor, which is actually pretty rapid, and also 256GB of internal storage. Of course, not forgetting the overall battery life, which is actually pretty good too. Given all of this, I can certainly see myself recommending the Poco device, and as a result, it gets my Value Award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below and how you feel it compares to some of its key competitors. And if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification. All of which would be greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.